Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll wait a few moments while folks join us. Good morning. Thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the Partnership for College Completion, welcome to today's webinar, the ILEA Initiative, Lessons Learned, Part 1. My name is Paula Hanley. I'm a Senior Partnerships Manager with the Partnership for College Completion. I've had the privilege of working directly with colleges and universities on the ILEA Initiative for the last 6 years. I'll be serving as your moderator today. I'm joined by my colleagues from PCC, Lisa Castillo-Richmond, Mike Abrahamson, Giselle Palacios, along with Rachel Feldman and Johanna Quinn, who conducted the NORC Fordham research study on ILEA. During our webinar today, these are the items that we'll cover. We'll give you a quick overview of the Partnership for College Completion, how the ILEA initiative was formed, some of the equity strategies, plans, and coaching programming supports, how colleges and universities have made change, institutional data and student outcomes. And then we'll go to the NORC Fordham research team study that was conducted on ILEA. And then at the end, we'll have question and discussion. We encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your toolbar, and then we'll have some closing remarks. Now I'll turn it over to Lisa Castillo-Richmond, Executive Director of the Partnership for College Completion.
Hello, everyone. I am so thrilled to be with you all today in community, talking about an effort that the Partnership for College Completion and a number of our college and university partners over the past several years have been engaged in to advance equity and student success on 2- and 4-year public and private nonprofit campuses across the state. Many of you have asked us to have conversations like this, so we are thrilled to be able to convene across 2 different webinars this spring, one today for the next 90 minutes, and also another in May in which we will be able to finish digging into this long-term, large-scale community of practice in Illinois. First, I want to get started just talking a little bit about our organization for those of you who may not know us as well. PCC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that works to advance policies, practices, and systems in Illinois to increase college completion and eliminate racial and socioeconomic disparities in college degree outcomes in the state of Illinois, particularly for Black, Latinx, low-income, and first-generation college students. We were established in 2016, and our work really falls into 3 primary categories of action. On the next slide, you'll see PCC does work in state policy and advocacy. We work on an agenda that mostly centers affordability, college access, persistence, completion, and accountability. A lot of this works intimately hand in hand with the work we do at the campus level. Our college and university partnerships start and end with the realization that good policy and good policy implementation always begins and ends with what happens on our campuses with our equity practitioners, with faculty, staff, administrators, and ultimately, what is the experience that students are having on campuses across the state of Illinois. And finally, our third area of work is really about research and data. So how do we shine a spotlight and tell a story about what is happening in Illinois higher education, and how do we format questions and answers to some of these longstanding, deep-rooted issues that are preventing our students and our institutions from serving students, families, and communities in the ways that we want them to, in the ways that we know they can. So how do we continue to work in community, in collaboration to advance this work, and utilizing data and evidence to make the case for that and advance that work? As PCC has gotten moving in these many different program areas, and many of you probably know us and work with us in a lot of different ways, I think there are a few factors that are really critical as we tell this story about the ILEA initiative that launched back in 2018. So PCC was the first and is the only organization dedicated exclusively to higher education advocacy in the state of Illinois. And we look like a lot of other states. We look like a lot of other organizations in some other states on that front. But what does make us unique is the way in which we do both policy advocacy work and campus level work for both policy implementation and supporting different equity initiatives at the campus levels through deep partnership with colleges and universities and people doing the work at the campus level. This is deeply rooted in collaboration. It is deeply deferential to the institutions and their expertise and understanding how policy and practice at the state and campus level interact and what that means for students and for practitioners, those working on the campuses in Illinois. PCC has also been able to, through data and research, shine a spotlight on the issues that have been, affecting Illinois students for years, and highlighting the data that will make the strongest case for that, and then working in partnership with colleges and universities, legislators, and others to make the case for action, but to be really thoughtful about that. Not every issue should be legislated. So how do we work at the campus level to address the issues that we have identified through data and research? And then lastly, as a trusted partner, as I mentioned, PCC has worked in a lot of different ways to build deep and trusting collaborative relationships, understanding that people at the campus level are the experts in this work, and wanting to work closely with them to develop solutions that will be sustainable and effective for students. Now, I want to set the context for the ILEA initiative. I know many of you know parts of this story very, very well. And so today we just want to set up that context of, how did we get started, and to remember what was the state level context at that moment in time as we launched this community of practice. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this work is that in 2017, as PCC was just a few months old, we started moving across the state to have conversations with higher education leaders in different spaces, but all across the state, in every part of the state, talking about what were some of the opportunities and challenges in higher education, what were some of the solutions that people who had been working on the ground for years, for decades, were doing to address these issues, and how could an organization like PCC support what was happening at the campus level. And I do want to say none of this would have been possible without our deeply committed group of foundation partners. This work was provided from 2018 to 2025 with the support of philanthropy. PCC did not receive public funding for this work. We did not charge institutions. This was a group of institutions and practitioners at PCC that came together to do this work, and it was deeply supported by philanthropy. Slide. So as we began, I think a couple contextual factors are relevant. So while today there are a lot of things happening related to higher education, equity, student success in Illinois, at the time, we were really on the heels of the budget impasse in the state that had deeply hurt higher education and students. We had a 2-year budget impasse. This work got started a couple of years after that. We had not yet, the state had not yet published the Thriving Illinois Plan, the strategic plan for higher education, which names many of these things as priorities and puts forth data that shows these deep disparities in higher education. So this predates all of that as we got started. But it predates the working group at Chicago State University that focused on access and success in Illinois for Black students. So it was quite a different context than we're in today. However, many of the things that were starting on the campuses, some campuses had been doing equity work for years. That wasn't true across the board, but there had been certainly pockets of excellence in terms of adopting best practices from the literature, working with national organizations that have prioritized this work. There were pockets of that happening across a number of institutions across the state, including on some of the campuses that ultimately joined the ILEA initiative. But the real issue we wanted to address was to work in community with institutions to understand how we could move the needle on these very deep, long-standing, and very significant racial disparities and socioeconomic disparities in terms of access, persistence, and success at the campus level. And we wanted to work with institutions who were like-minded and committed to doing this work in community with each other and with PCC, even absent additional resources. So there were not, large funding streams coming from the state or from PCC to do this work. I think that is a critical piece of this as well. These were institutions that voluntarily joined a community of practice to do this work without a state mandate and without funding sources to support their work in any additional way than they were already receiving. And a third factor of this, I think, is that we did ask that this work be steered at the campus level by a very senior level team of practitioners, administrators, and that was inclusive of the president, and it was guided by a set of core beliefs. So as we worked to recruit institutions in the ILEA initiative back in 2018, we said this needed to be driven by and steered by a very senior group of administrators, but then it also needed to trickle down to a number of practitioners across the campus as well. So as we got moving on our institutional change work, because this was certainly evolving for us as a young organization as we move forward, certainly driven by research, data, and literature from many different places that informed this work and the design of the ILEA initiative. We were guided by a few key priorities in our institutional change work. Number one, equity plan development and implementation. We knew we wanted to support this work at the campuses. To our knowledge, at that time, there were no equity plans in place in any institution in the state of Illinois, and we thought it would be a way to get institutions all on the same page in terms of naming what they were trying to do on their campuses in terms of equity and student success, and to develop a set of strategies and tactics to move that work forward. So the equity plans became a key focus of our institutional change work. The second area, as I've already mentioned, is the role of campus leadership. So the buy-in and visible leadership of the president and cabinet members and other divisional leaders across the campus, faculty leadership, staff engaged in the academic and student affairs sides of the house. How do we make sure that these leaders are bought into, feel responsible for, and visible in this work on campus? And then lastly, the role of institutional policy and practice change, the role of disaggregated data, the role of examining and auditing policies and practices at the campus level, not taking anything for granted when we are looking for things that are either preventing and causing roadblocks for students to successful college outcomes, or things that could support them or maybe are unnecessary vestiges of the past that we should really take a critical look at and consider changing, updating, or removing. So who joined us in this work? Our original intention was to really get a diverse group of institutions. We wanted public and private nonprofit institutions, small and large, community colleges, four-year colleges, and universities. Those that have been engaged in equity work for a while, those who were just getting started in this work and had a deep interest in doing it. And we were able to do that. I think in our original iteration of this, we had more balance between community colleges and four-year institutions. And as we got this work moving and institutions were required to share disaggregated data, we became much more community college heavy. And I think that isn't surprising when I think about the history of equity reforms in higher education across the country. The community colleges were really many of the institutions that had been leading on this. There were more national organizations dedicated to supporting community colleges. There was the Aspen Prize and things of that nature. So community colleges had really been engaging in inquiry about student success and access questions for a very long time. Now, who are the students in this initiative served by these institutions? So this gives you a snapshot on three particular points. So the vast majority of students served by the 25 institutions were associate degree seeking. So about 2/3 of those. About 20% of those are bachelor's degree seeking students across those 25, and 14% were certificate seeking students. You see almost half of the students were Latinx students, and this is among the state's undergraduates. So within these 25 institutions, 47% of Illinois' Latinx undergrads were in these 25 institutions in the state. There was a significant number of HSIs or emerging HSIs that were represented in the cohort. These institutions serve about 40% of Black student undergrads in the state, 30% of Pell students, and 30% of all students. You also see down here at the bottom that the ILEA cohort compared to the overall population of Illinois institutions, we have a far greater percentage of students of color than the mean in the state, and also a greater percentage of adult students. You see Pell students is roughly on par with the state as a whole. The next slide talks about our ILEA core beliefs. And this is something that we have shared many times, but we do believe that it was a critical factor in engaging institutions, recruiting them, and keeping them engaged over the course of the initiatives. And there were, to name it, there were a number of folks who bought into this, a number of institutional leaders, and there were others who didn't. And we had some really robust conversations about this. And ultimately, if you did not believe these things, or you did not believe them with some nuance, then those institutions did not join our ILEA cohort. And it starts with colleges are responsible for graduating all of their degree-seeking students. These are students they admit into their institutions, that they believe all of their students they've admitted can graduate with the right tools, information, and supports, that these disparities were not created by the folks working in higher education today, but that we are responsible for eliminating them with urgency, and that we know things that will help support us in doing this. We've learned things over time, and that the college has agency in this work. The overview of ILEA here really just talks about what were some of the things we leaned into. And Paula is going to talk more about this, but institutional teams steering this work were the ones who connected largely with PCC over time. However, there were dozens of people or more on each campus doing the actual work of equity practice at the campus level. Disaggregated data was a very important factor in this. Faculty support and involvement is always a game changer. It is where the scale in the institution is and where students spend the most face time is with faculty. There was support and coaching and individual engagement from the PCC team with the teams at the campus level. And then the fact that this was a community of practice and we were bringing people together to learn with their peers. And my final slide here is about the programming that PCC engaged in over time. And this was an evolving, slate of programming. This was informed by our institutional leaders and those participating in the ILEA initiative. We developed it, year by year over time with information from them, but really focused on these key levers of action. There were the campus teams, individual engagement, the equity plan development and implementation support and reflection on that year over year. There was some data capacity building and utilizing data close to practice. We had annual convenings, biannual, sometimes more frequently than that, through equity academies and equity institutes. We had workshops and webinars on a one-off basis. We had learning communities around different topics or for different individuals who wanted to convene with peers on particular topics. And then this work around documenting and evaluating impact. I will go ahead and pass to Paula.
Thanks, Lisa. How did we do this? I'm going to spend a few moments talking about our process and how it was developed. We partnered with Achieving the Dream. And what we did with most institutions at the time was we conducted what was called the institutional capacity assessment tool developed by Achieving the Dream. And they even adapted it so that we could administer it to our four-year college partners as well. And at the time, there were seven areas. ATD has since adapted it and changed these areas. But at the time, the areas that institutions assessed themselves on their capacity to do different work were equity, leadership and vision, teaching and learning, data and technology, policies and practices, strategy and planning, and engagement and communication. And then afterwards, we met with each individual campus and we held cafe discussions, and it was an opportunity for them to sort of roll up their sleeves and dig in and talk about, hey, we need to build more capacity here or over here. As you can imagine, two of the areas that cropped up in almost every institution rated themselves the lowest in terms of their capacity to do this work at the time were equity and data and technology. So what we were able to do then was to lean into these areas a little bit more, not only with the colleges and individual coaching sessions, but it also guided some of our programming work in the early years in order to be able to support the equity planning process. We created an equity plan guide and template for colleges to use. This was meant to be a guide. We didn't want it to be sort of cookie cutter, but we wanted to sort of guide the institutions and encourage them to tailor this plan in ways that made sense to their institution. We rolled this out via webinars and explained the different pieces of the template. We didn't want them to do it all at once, but to be mindful about how they were progressing through the template as well. Our staff, our PCC coaches, as we referred to them, had regular monthly meetings with core teams as they developed their plans. And we provided feedback at different points in time on the plans as they completed the sections. We wanted to ensure that there were a few components in the plan that institutions addressed. One, and Lisa touched on this earlier, we strongly believe that endorsement at the highest level was really important, and we asked for sort of public commitment and sign off via signatures of each institution. By doing this, the institutions would have a group of leaders sort of committed to carrying out this work, right? The second section was we wanted the institutions tell us who you are in this plan so that others reading it would know as well. What kind of students do you serve? What does that population breakdown look like? What does your staff and faculty staff demographic breakdown look like? And then we also asked them to specifically address the populations the equity plan would serve: Black, Latinx, and low-income students. And also to include how they would engage their campus community in the effort of building and implementing an equity plan. Because what we knew was that it had to take the whole college in a holistic look at doing this kind of work. We also asked them to define, sort of tell us like how you're doing right now, today. Many institutions, as Lisa had mentioned, were already doing equity work. Many had some great student success strategies in place. So sort of tell us where you are in retention and completion, and to also specifically identify how Black, Latinx, and low-income students are doing. This was a baseline then for colleges to work from. We also asked them to be blue sky and put in those future vision and goals. This part of the equity plan talked about what each campus would need to do to begin to achieve equitable outcomes. I want to say that, we also were mindful to know that closing gaps, was aspirational, but that at least working towards it was the right thing to do, right? It included benchmarks for achieving equitable outcomes for Black, Latinx, and low-income students. In completing this process, colleges and universities had the opportunity to be aspirational and define what it would take. We also asked them to include institutional strategies. In this specific section, we said identify the specific strategies that your institution will do to begin to eliminate disparities for Black, Latinx, and low-income students. And also to include any supports that you would put in place for faculty and staff to do this. I think as we started out the process, we really were focusing on the student success strategies. But what most institutions found out, and I think this speaks again to like diving into the capacity to do this work, is that, whoa, we need to take a step back and we actually need to educate our faculty and staff a little bit more about what it's going to take. So let's build some strategies into the plan for that as well. We also asked institutions to put in a section on evaluation. How are the strategies that you implement going to be evaluated? How will you know that they'll be successful? And then the budget implications. And some institutions had money budgeted. Some were looking at additional possible grant work with the outside grants and then internal budgeting processing as well. But we felt this was important to say, how are you going to support the strategies that are in the plan? One of the most important pieces that took place in developing the plan was how institutions defined equity. What most institutions found as we started out this process was that they did not have a common definition of equity amongst their campuses. And institutions took this on in different ways. Many of them did different types of focus groups, discussions. Sometimes it was the core team themselves that wrote the working definition and then took it out and shared it amongst their campus. I'm going to say in most instances, the actual definition of equity went through governing structures, and this was really important too in terms of getting campus buy-in. You can go to the next slide. So then this entire process took about 12 to 18 months of institutions developing their equity plans, learning, doing, and then COVID hit. But despite this, 22 of the 25 ILEA institutions publicly launched their equity plans in the summer of 2020. And then PCC was able to sort of jumpstart some of the strategies within each equity plan with these $12,000, what we called Catalyst Grant Awards. To be eligible for these, institutions had to publicly publish their equity plan and also submit their data to the Post-Secondary Data Partnership. I can't think of any other state at the time that had 22 institutions that publicly we put them on the PCC website, put an equity plan, had institutional data in it, strategies, all of that. It was unique in that way as well. You can go to the next slide. So I want to talk for a moment about some of the common strategies that we found that were implemented. Many institutions put strategies in about designing and redesigning the first year experience. Focus on a sense of belonging. It wasn't that they weren't doing this already, but they knew that they needed to do it more intentionally, specifically for Black, Latinx, and low-income students. Many of them redesigned their new student orientation and onboarding. They wanted to ensure that students had an educational plan or a guided pathway to completion. And many institutions, many community colleges especially, did not have first-year seminar and student success courses, and some of these were implemented as well to help students. There was an intentional focus on gateway math and English and reforms to developmental education in many of the plans, and ensuring that more students could take and complete college-level math and English in their first year. There was a redesign of academic advising structures. Many institutions assigned advisors to these target populations and began to work with them in different ways. Many institutions had implemented early alert systems or were in the process of doing it, and so it gave them an opportunity to be even more targeted with specific populations for Black, Latinx, and low-income students, and this was important as well. Many institutions focused on increasing credit accumulation rates for students, building capacity for mentoring programs for students of color. Building spaces and cultural centers for students was important, and this was put into many of the plans as well. I think this came about as not only pre-COVID, but certainly in COVID. Supports for food security and basic needs. Food pantries were implemented as part of the equity plans, community resources and outreach for students. How to ensure that students had access to SNAP benefits was important too. The last two, completion grants for students and emergency grants, these were pretty innovative at the time too, and many institutions worked with their foundations to create completion grants for students and emergency grants for students. And then also many institutions sort of conducted audits on looking at the barriers to financial aid and redesigning many of the hold processes that prevented students from registering for the next term. You can go to the next slide. This slide really talks about some of the strategies that were implemented more for faculty and staff. They created equity and cultural competency training for faculty and staff, designed training for faculty on inclusive pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching, worked with faculty to increase the use of open and educational resources to reduce costs for students, built data competency training for faculty and staff to make data-driven decisions to close equity gaps, developed strategies to increase hiring and retention of faculty and staff of color, and created positions during this time, such as Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to support institutional capacity for DEI work. You can go to the next slide. So how did we do this? As we referred to it, the coaches were able to meet regularly with these core teams. The core teams included, we let the institutions decide how they were going to develop their core teams, but we did really ask for them to have, someone from the academic side. Many times it was a dean of instruction, a VP of student affairs or student development. Enrollment was a part of it. Some had financial aid. Some had their presidents on their core teams. Others chose not to have their president on the core team, but the core team informed the president regularly of what was happening with the plans. We, in the early beginning of this, we traveled directly to the colleges and met with them on their campuses. We felt like this was important so that we could get to know each campus's unique culture. And then during COVID, we held these meetings virtually with the core teams. We were mindful, very mindful, that each campus was unique with its own unique culture, and building a high level of trust with each institution was important to do this work because they were sharing, what was working, what was not working, disaggregated data. So it was a real, collaborative effort in that way. During 2018 to 2024, we had over 400 individual meetings and conversations and coaching sessions with our partners. So our programming really included three main supports. As Lisa mentioned earlier, we held an ILEA annual summit. We've had 8 in total, convened over 200 plus campus and university leaders, including faculty, at these sessions. And this was an opportunity for ILEA colleges and universities to network and share practices. Then we also developed these ILEA Equity Institutes. We held 4 of them virtually. We felt it was really important to sort of intentionally get to more of the practitioners on the student services side and faculty as well. And so that's what the equity institutions were developed to do. We also held 2 ILEA Equity Academy for Presidents and Cabinets in partnership with the Aspen Institute. This was an opportunity for us to bring together 20 colleges and universities, 80 plus senior leaders. It was an opportunity for them to think about their leadership teams, their institutional capacity to do this work, and also gave them an opportunity to meet with their leadership teams to really dig into how they were going to position themselves and find resources to support transformational change on their campuses. During our time at both our summits and our equity institutes and at our Equity Academy for Presidents and Cabinets, we were able to bring a lot of institution leaders across the country that have done this work. They've made transformational change at their campuses. This is just a short list of some of those folks who have done this work. And while it was both aspirational, they reminded us that the work can be done. And that this is a journey, and I think that's important. I think it's important in today's context as well to think about this work as a journey. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Lisa.
This just shares a little bit of a timeline. We've spoken through this a lot, but 2018, we're recruiting institutions. In the fall of 2018, we launched this. We launched our initial partnership with Achieving the Dream. Going through 2019 into 2020 with the equity plan work, continuing with some of the partnerships, hosting convenings and different opportunities for programming, and then continuing through to where we are today and sort of recapping this stuff. Slide. I think there are a few things that are really key, and you're going to hear this from some of our other speakers, and maybe some of your questions will get to this as well. And we'll dig into each of these at the subsequent webinar as well. But I think collaborative leadership is a big piece of this. I mean, I don't think I can overstate the fact that institutions joined this initiative voluntarily. There was no requirement to do so. You know, they were invited and asked to join, and there was a pretty significant amount of time and effort they needed to dedicate to doing the work. You know, no matter how many times PCC convened or how many inspiring speakers were put in front of the cohort, everything that matters happens back at the campus level. So, you know, I think the leadership, the engagement of the leadership, the connection to the mission of the institution, the scale of those working on it, the consistency of the messaging, you know, the alignment across plans, so of strategic enrollment management plans, strategic plans, operational plans, the goals of the campus, the goals of leadership. You know, the more those were aligned, the more this penetrated across the institution into all aspects of the work. The engaged faculty in planning and development, again, you know, my comment earlier about the scale in the institution, the face time with students, you know, where are they spending their time, including adjunct faculty in this. As we understand, many institutions have many courses taught by adjunct faculty, so engaging them in this work as well. Sense of belonging on campus, how students feel the culture of their campus is in terms of welcoming them and wanting them to be there. Inclusive environment as well, not just for students, but also for faculty and staff as well. I mentioned this earlier, but creating a data-informed culture is key to success. Looking at disaggregated data and institutions' ability to do that is a huge piece of this work. Focusing on first-year experience, you know, redesigning onboarding experiences, how students flow through courses, and, you know, how they connect with peers and adults within the institution, the gateway course structure and flow, and then how students are gaining early momentum in their early years, connecting deeply to their course of study, and then also talking to students. You know, we learned that, you know, how well campuses are actually connected to and understanding how their students are experiencing their campus is critically important for equity work as well. Now I'm happy to pass it to my colleague Giselle for a look at the data.
Hi everyone, my name is Giselle Palacios. I am the Research and Data Associate here at PCC. Been here for about a year now, and a good amount of my time has been dedicated to working and analyzing ILEA data. So let's get started on the analysis of the equity plans. Over the past 5 years, the 25 equity plans developed by ILEA colleges and universities have resulted in the implementation of about 240 equity strategies. So these plans, as Paula has talked about, were designed by institutions themselves, each addressing unique needs, and collectively spanned across 10 key policy areas such as developmental education, academic supports, and faculty and staff development. While all 240 strategies share the same goal of closing completion gaps for Black, Latinx, and low-income students, their implementation varied across institutions. Each strategy was tailored to the specific needs of the institution's student population, informed by an in-depth institution-level analysis of early momentum metrics. Another important element included in the equity plans was an evaluation framework, and in addition to this, the PCC data team also identified key metrics, both leading and lagging indicators to potentially evaluate the effectiveness of each strategy. These metrics were gathered through the Post-Secondary Data Partnership, or the PDP, which collects data on early momentum, long-term cohort, and non-cohort metrics, with the ability to disaggregate by race, Pell status, and more. And so for those unfamiliar with the PDP, it provides a comprehensive set of dashboards and student level data files, which we use to conduct our own analysis. And to give you an idea of what our analysis look like, I'll give an example. So some of the strategies focused on staffing and supporting specific programs for Latinx students or for Black students. And so to evaluate the success of the strategies, we can ask, are students performing better as a result of receiving the program services? And so we can then examine metrics like first year GPA or retention rates from the PDP. And then by linking each of the 240 strategies to one or more of these metrics, we had nearly 500 data points to assess the impact of these equity strategies. And so obviously it would take forever to go through all 500 metrics individually. So I've summarized a few that were most commonly used for the overall ILEA cohort here in this table. Retention rates, credit accumulation, and first-year GPA are all good early momentum indicators for our colleges. Over 50 of the equity strategies were specifically aimed at improving retention rates, and I'll dive into this deeper in the next slide. For credit accumulation, we looked at two factors. One was the credit completion ratio, which shows the percentage of credits earned compared to those attempted, which we have here listed in this table, but what we don't show is the 15 credit and 30 credit thresholds, which are critical for ensuring on-time degree completion, depending on whether the student is full-time or part-time. So for first year GPA, we looked at the percentage of students in each GPA range, and for all of these metrics, they were disaggregated by race, Pell status, and first generation status. So now here's the key takeaways from this table. There are a few notable increases, but also some decreases. However, most changes are small, around 1 to 5%. And while these changes are worth monitoring, they aren't necessarily conclusive on their own. And as you may know, the effects of the pandemic likely explain some of the changes we see. The good data we have is from 2019 to 2021, so COVID happened right in the middle. And of course, we don't know the counterfactual or what would have happened if ILEA efforts hadn't continued through the pandemic. So it is important to keep this in mind when we're looking at this table. Slide. So now looking at retention rates. Overall, we saw an increase in full-time fall-to-fall retention rates at community colleges, while at four-year universities, retention rates generally declined. So looking at the different racial groups, we observed a significant 21% increase in Black student retention at community colleges. At four-year universities, Black and Latinx student retention rates initially declined, but then they started to recover. And so when we break down retention by Pell status, we see similar trends at both community colleges and four-year universities. And the same pattern holds for first-generation students, though that chart's not included here. So in summary, we're seeing two contrasting trends: an increase in retention rates at community colleges and a decline followed by recovery at four-year universities. And so I think this illustrates how complex it is to interpret this data and assess the effectiveness of ILEA, especially with the pandemic acting as a confounding factor. It's also important to note that we're only looking at the first two cohorts of ILEA, as 2019 serves as the baseline and not overall at the 5 years. And so here's why. Slide. Slide again. So we've encountered some challenges when it comes to analyzing the outcomes of the ILEA initiative, and much of this stems from the data collection process through the PDP. As you can see, the data we received varied each year, and so this inconsistency has made it difficult to conduct a thorough analysis of the ILEA cohort as a whole, and has posed challenges in tracking progress over time. This raises the question, is the data complete? Is it representative of the student population? And therefore, is it accurate? At times when we use the PDP dashboards, we noticed some discrepancies due to missing data, which prevented us from getting a complete picture. As a result, we ended up doing more data maintenance on our side than we initially anticipated. And to verify if the reported data was accurate, we cross-referenced it with other sources such as IPEDS and College Scorecard, but this approach was somewhat limited because many of the metrics in the PDP are not available in public data sets, hence why we turned to a tool like the PDP in the first place. And one of the key challenges we didn't foresee at the start of ILEA, as already mentioned, was the limited capacity and resources for extensive data work. We've come to realize that just like us, many of our ILEA partners have small data teams, and therefore it can be difficult to find time to conduct in-depth analysis of outcomes related to equity strategies. We could have benefited from capacity building and perhaps some data training, but it just wasn't written in the plan. And so this is just one of several lessons we've learned from the ILEA initiative. And like Lisa mentioned, we'll be diving deeper into these lessons at our next webinar on May 2nd. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to Paula.
Hi, everyone. So again, I am going to now turn over the presentation to Rachel Feldman and Johanna Quinn, who conducted the NORC Fordham Research Study on ILEA.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Just so you know, in order to see my notes and make it look like I'm looking, let's see here. Can you see me? Good morning. My name is Rachel Feldman. I currently work at American Institutes for Research, and I am joined by my collaborator, Johanna Quinn from Fordham University. And for the last 4 years, Dr. Quinn and I have been studying the Partnership for College Completion's ILEA Initiative. This work was supported by the WT Grant Foundation while I was still a staff member at NORC at the University of Chicago. It's been exciting and fascinating work to learn from the partnership and from the participating colleges and universities. And in this presentation, we're going to give you an overview of what we have learned to date. Please know that while data collection has ended, we are still actively learning from all of you and from this work. Next slide, please. The agenda for today is to give you a brief overview of the study that we conducted and what data was collected, and then discuss some of what we've learned. We're going to highlight 3 broader points and then situate the findings in the current socio-political climate. Briefly, we're going to discuss about publicly disaggregating data by subgroup, how equity plans were motivated, and how that translated into policies and programs, and the importance of being part of a collaborative environment. Next slide, please. So the study itself was organized in 2 sections, and the first was our analysis of the participating schools' equity plans. And here we studied what schools said they planned to do and the language they used to describe those efforts. The second effort was data collection in schools themselves, and we selected 6 case study schools, 3 community colleges, and 3 four-year institutions, and conducted interviews and observations with the faculty, staff, and administrators there. Next slide, please. Data collection, as you can see here, occurred between April 2021 and June 2023. And so the findings that we share today are from that time period. We interviewed most participants twice, conducted observations as we could, primarily with equity teams. This was during the tail end of the pandemic, so all of the interviews and observations were conducted virtually. We also interviewed the PCC staff, and lastly, on a side note, we wanted to just know and thank all of the schools that had opened their doors to us. This was one of the easiest recruitment efforts we have experienced in research, and just want to acknowledge how much the schools clearly committed and wanted to learn from their efforts, so thank you. The research questions involved, next slide, please, focused on 2 broad questions. The first is, how are colleges and universities building racially equitable practices at their institutions? And the second was, how does a facilitated collaborative, and by this we mean the ILEA program and PCC, play in fostering racial equity within colleges and universities? And to answer these questions, we focused on how PCC itself engaged with its ILEA partner institutions and how those institutions responded. At each of the selected schools, we focused on their policy selection, institutional factors that could facilitate or limit the ability to implement those policies, and how administrators, faculty, and staff understood equity. We also examined PCC's role in supporting peer-to-peer collaborations and equity policy implementation at these 6 schools. Next slide, please. So here you see our larger theory of change. on how participating colleges and universities were undergoing cycles of improvement when they implemented their equity plan. So you look in the bottom right corner, and you can see that here they're implementing the plan, they're learning from that implementation and making changes based on those learnings. And that this cycle was influenced by their work with ILEA. And that occurred through the summits that they participated in, webinars, the written guidance in the plan guidance, and then the ongoing relationships with PCC coaches. We focused on these efforts as a process of organizational change, and you see this at the top, specifically racially focused organizational change. So we examined schools' ideologies, the organizational structures, like the routines that have been put in place to accomplish tasks, and the resources that have been dedicated to those equity efforts. We also examined member schemas about racial equity and how we all think about race and how that influences the implementation of programs and policies. Next slide, please. So this slide very briefly outlines the order of operations. Here that we analyzed all those plans, and then we selected the schools, and then we collected study data. Next slide, please. This is an overall summary. Here you can see that we interviewed the PCC staff. School interviews included administrators, faculty, and staff. Staff include people like the financial aid advisors, tutoring managers, and deans. And together we conducted 183 interviews across these 6 schools and PCC. Next slide. We also observed PCC summits and many equity team meetings at the individual schools.
Okay, I'm going to share with you some of our findings. One key thing we witnessed during our investigation of the ILEA collaboration was member colleges and universities' commitment to disaggregating data by race and socioeconomic status and sharing that data publicly. This is unique among higher education institutions, as other scholars like Gandera and Hearn from 2019 article have noted that there's a hesitancy from institutions in making data available to the public for fear that they will be shamed for their data, or otherwise it will negatively affect them in a competitive market. And as of today, all 25 of the ILEA schools have created equity plans and made them publicly available. This is a remarkable accomplishment, as many of these plans were drafted during the COVID-19 stay-at-home orders and throughout a pandemic. It is not only that schools develop plans, but also that member schools adhered closely to the research-based guidance provided by PCC, including all relevant components of the equity plan, and in many cases, closely mirroring the language provided by PCC. Our analysis for this section is based on 24 equity plans posted by 2024. Of these plans, 75% of schools completed all sections, developing equity statements, using data to describe the current state, creating measurable institutional strategies, and gathering relevant signatures. Unlike past equity plans, ILEA members' plans also included budgets and signatories from various stakeholders, and they rarely blame students for the institution's shortcomings. Importantly, these plans also defined equity, included strategic, time-bound strategies, and evaluations plans, making another departure from previous equity planning initiatives, most notably plans created among California community colleges. Although participating colleges and universities widely varied in their institutional strategies, they tended to address a range of 10 topics. The most common included academic support, equity data management, developmental education, faculty staff development, human resources staffing, institutional procedures and operations, student financial supports, student identity-based programs, student transition pathways, and student wraparound supports. Policy spanned all areas of campus, engaging institutional research teams, faculty, staff, and administration across institutions. Here, we provide information on the institutional strategies. Almost all included some form of academic support and professional development for faculty and staff. Finding ways for students to transition into and out of the institution were also present in more than 60% of plans. Student wraparound supports were present in slightly less than half of the school's equity plans, as were strategies focusing on hiring or firing practices. And student identity-based programs like Black male success initiatives were present in about 50% of equity plans.
The second learning is that equity plans are driven by racial disparities, but rarely target these specific focal groups. Next slide, please. So here, as PCC noted in their presentation, that they provided an explicit framework for their equity plan guidance, that schools were to make clear that they, and not the students, were responsible for improving college completion. Schools were supposed to target African American or Black students, Latinx students, and Pell eligible students. PCC also emphasized that the goal was not perfection, but rather for schools to identify their starting point so they can work to making context-specific improvements. Next slide, please. And this slide shows that just over half of the 24 schools we looked at included a strategy focused on Pell eligible students, and about just half had at least one strategy focused on race. These values, the numerical values, are higher for students that are in schools that are minority serving, that MSI bars. And note that in the last one, the historically white serving institutions still struggle to articulate policies focused explicitly on students from Black and Latinx backgrounds. You can see that in the bar that's at about a third. Next slide, please. We looked at if policies were strategic, racially motivated, and targeted. Here are definitions of these words. So by strategic, we mean disaggregated data that was used to describe the issue to be remedied. By racially motivated, we mean that a racial disparity served as the motivation for the practice. And by targeted, we mean that the practice itself focused on the named racial subgroup. Next slide, please. Most policies were strategic and racially motivated, but were not targeted. This is what that looks like. So one college's math strategy was developed because, quote, the college recognizes that college-level math competency is a barrier to student success and is committed to helping students reach their goals by developing and staffing a math success center and hiring a math success advisor. As we can see, the policy is strategic by using data disaggregated by race to illustrate the discrepancies in math. The policy is motivated by race, as the school states it's about the populations to be included. Quote, all students whose placement reflects unpreparedness in math, with special emphasis on closing the achievement gap for African American and Latinx students. Next slide, please. However, as we see here, the policy itself is not racially targeted. To implement the math success program, the college proposed to hire, quote, full-time mathematics placement and success advisor dedicated to guiding students from the complexity of math placement through program completion, workforce, or transfer to a 4-year institution program, as well as creating a dedicated space for students to learn mathematics. The college here notes that the program differentially impacts Black, Latinx, and Pell eligible students, and while the policy is notable for its depth, it remains unclear how this program strategically focuses attention solely on Black, Latinx, or Pell eligible students. In contrast, next slide, please, we see here an example of a strategic, racially motivated, and targeted policy, right? The college selected this policy because, quote, recent data has shown that lower on-campus attendance for undergraduate African-American students, highlighting the need for the college to build a more welcoming environment and a stronger sense of community for African-American students. The college targeted their Black and Latinx student populations by, quote, building a culture of inclusion through this multicultural resource center designed to, quote, sponsor programs and resources promoting Latinx and African American student success and serve as a hub of information about diverse cultural events on campus. Next slide, please. And to reiterate, again, only about half the schools had a policy that specifically articulated a racial subgroup as a beneficiary. Next slide, please.
The final insight we will share today focuses on how participating in this facilitated collaboration supports member colleges and universities' commitments to equity planning efforts and implementation. Overall, While schools varied in their experience with strategic planning and the institutionalization of equity, with some engaging with Achieving the Dream or other external partners prior to ILEA, we found a shared belief in the value that members derive from networking and learning from peer and aspirant institutions in a supported environment. This sentiment emerged in multiple interviews with administrators, faculty, and staff from the institutions we consulted. For instance, one staff member said, quote, "When you bring a group together that's not typically talking to each other about these issues, it sharpens us. It sharpens our ability to just discuss equity." They noted that participating in equity summits and webinars provided a common language for discussing equity, as well as readings and tools to push the conversations to new levels. Others mentioned that the physical environment of gatherings allowed teams, often busy with day-to-day realities of their jobs, to engage with one another in a new space, ensuring everyone was aligned and facilitating internal planning. Learning from other institutions was essential. For many two-year colleges, forming partnerships with four-year universities to solidify transfer agreements was crucial to achieving their equity goals. For four-year institutions, observing how two-year colleges developed guided pathways or created one-stop shops for financial aid, admissions, and advising offered them clear examples to adapt to their own institutions and specific contacts for support when facing challenges at their schools. As one individual noted, ILEA enabled schools to, quote, "network with other colleges that were further along in their DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives." Because we're all on a continuum. So I think having access to that network helps me to be more targeted and strategic in how we develop our DEI work. Witnessing the initiatives of others and sharing their own achievements were vital for maintaining momentum in equity planning and implementation. Despite all the positive aspects that collaboration provided, members also expressed significant challenges that warrant further consideration. On the one hand, the number of schools involved and the facilitation by PCC helped create a culture of accountability. Moreover, ILEA summits and other peer-to-peer convenings, along with networking opportunities provided by PCC, were well attended. ILEA member colleges and universities spoke glowingly about what they learned from speakers and one another, as well as the joy of connecting with like-minded colleagues in ways that solidified professional networks. However, on the other hand, member colleges and universities experienced significant turnover among staff at their institutions, as did PCC. Many member colleges sought even more engagement, support, and coaching from PCC than they were given, as well as a consistent PCC contact. The rapid growth and turnover at PCC gave some members pause, but most reported appreciating the partnership. Being part of the ILEA network enables members to learn from local colleagues in similar positions and share best practices, helping Illinois grow as a state. Additionally, some member institutions have a longer history of engaging in practices to transform themselves to be more equity-minded, while others are just beginning the journey. Similarly, some member institutions have higher tax bases and more financial resources than others, allowing some to be more responsive by email and phone. PCC has communicated to member institutions that the goal for each school is progress rather than a fixed standard outcome. In practice, however, there is a tendency for PCC staff members to view schools that meet deadlines as those as doing the best equity work, and for schools with greater resources to be better equipped to conduct data analysis and plan strategically. Finally, some schools disagreed with certain policy initiatives that PCC engaged in.
Placing study findings in the current sociopolitical context. So what can the study do to inform this work in this current context? Next slide, please. The study period ended in 2023. At that time, schools expressed a variety of reasons they were hesitant to target policies directly to Black and Latinx students, naming them directly as policy beneficiaries. These reasons included a lack of know-how, a struggle with the equity plan template they found not flexible enough for their school's context, and a focused attempt to direct strategies towards the greatest number of students rather than the specific groups PCC identified. In our current climate, these issues remain. Next slide, please. For example, one school wrote, "I think we wrote a very intentionally vague plan because people don't, and myself included, we didn't know what to put in it. We are really paralyzed by the structure of the plan. They were like, okay, what are you going to do for Hispanic students? What are you going to do for Black students? We almost just repeated ourselves over and over again because of the way the categories were. I really wish we could have gotten more training or information." Schools, next slide, please, sorry. Schools also recognize that a Black student isn't just a Black student. They are not a monolith, right? Making it hard to know if a program targeting a specific group would actually overlook some of the students named for that group. Next slide, please. Schools also noted that these racially focused policies were great in intent, but touched very few students and took significant resources, making them question the overall utility and cost benefit.
Since the period of our study, and in light of reversals to affirmative action and the February 14th Dear Colleague letter, there has been increasing pressure to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Equity has been redefined from a means of addressing harm to something that is perceived as damaging to white racial groups and should be completely dismantled. So how can schools strive for equity amidst federal attacks on DEI? We don't claim to have all the answers, but our study highlights a few important considerations. Even during the better times of 2021 to 2023, our study period, as member institutions sought to increase the diversity of their workforce, they faced high turnover among staff and faculty of color. Moreover, staff and faculty of color reported frequently being called upon and feeling overburdened with the responsibility of carrying out equity work. The growing mental health needs of students, heavy workloads for advisors and staff, and resistance to change among faculty also hindered these efforts. These challenges will likely intensify, requiring institutions to devise new strategies to address them. However, we view the ILEA Collaborative, the collection and diversity of institutions across the state, as a positive development. It serves as a resource that colleges and universities can rely on for practical and psychological support and a potential political body for collaboration. Our finding that even well-intentioned, equity-committed schools remain hesitant to explicitly identify Black and Latinx students as policy beneficiaries warrants further reflection. If we set aside the language, recognizing that being explicit about benefits and resources directed to these populations may be less feasible in this moment, we must still consider what is occurring beneath the level of language. These populations have historically been marginalized by higher education, and colleges and universities need to be clearer now more than ever about who they are focusing on and what these policies entail for their beneficiaries. There have been significant advancements in the use of data, often enabling member colleges and universities to identify which students are struggling in specific courses and areas of campus. However, the reasons behind this underperformance are still not fully understood. Many schools use these findings to propel them to provide academic support to all students without fully investigating the political, cultural, social, and psychological factors contributing to this underperformance. This investigation can continue even if language explicitly supporting Black and Latinx populations faces increased scrutiny. We remain hopeful that ongoing collaboration may facilitate this deeper internal work. And finally, I want to reiterate Rachel's point. It has been our absolute pleasure to work with and learn from the committed schools involved in this collaborative. The ILEA Collaborative achieved remarkable support from member institutions. 25 members created publicly facing plans. Schools embraced strategic planning, used data to make decisions. PCC served as an equity accountability partner, helping schools create and implement plans throughout a pandemic. And President's commitment to equity made a significant difference. schools with more engaged presidents and leadership teams reported higher rates of success with their equity policies. Networking and professional development opportunities were beneficial. Schools shared best practices and learned from one another, using the time to adapt, implement, and remain committed to equity goals. Yet, even motivated colleges and universities with documented presidential commitment were hesitant to design racially conscious policies. Moving towards equitable college completion will require us to continue our commitments from leadership and collaboration among schools. Thank you so much. And I want to just acknowledge the other team members who have made this work possible, and I'm excited for the Q&A.
So we encourage you to type your questions into the question and answer box, or you can put them in the chat as well if you prefer to do it that way. And I think we had a question. Lisa, did you want to address that first question from the chat?
Sure. We can get the conversation starting here while people submit some more of their questions. I just want to thank Rachel and Johanna for engaging in this study. I think it was really important to us to understand how this worked, how it was working, what institutions said about the kinds of supports and things we were asking for, and what we were providing. It just enabled us to take a deeper look at what we did and where we're at as a state, because as I mentioned kind of at the outset of this call, the context has changed quite a bit. I mean, I think when we started this work, I sort of laid out a little bit of what that looked like, but certainly now, as the comment you ended on, this is a very different context for DEI work right now in the national context. It has been shifting over time, but now certainly the forces of anti-DEI sentiment and action are very ascendant right now. And also the work in the state has changed. So, the state's strategic plan, Illinois Board of Higher Education's A Thriving Illinois Strategic Plan, is supportive of much of this work and sort of moving, institutions in that direction around a set of shared goals and other supportive structures to enable some of these things. The state now has in state statute that institutions create equity plans. That is very different from when we started this work or when the institutions published their equity plans. We've heard from some of the folks who evaluated those equity plans that ILEA institutions had stronger plans. And that just makes a lot of intuitive sense because these institutions have been doing this work for a while. And I do think that, when we started doing this, we understood that in 5-6 years, you would not be closing historic, very significant, often double-digit disparities in student outcomes on campuses. We did not have the resources to support that. Institutions did not have the resources to support that. But I think if I can use an analogy, it's that we sort of pulled the boats to the shore, found the folks who wanted to get on the boats, helped the folks get on the boats, and then rowing in the same direction. And I think all of that work has counted for a lot. It's counted for a lot for the institutions that have been doing it and been able to create time and space to think about this more and think about their unique campuses and what their students need, what resources they have to do this, to ask for more resources from the state. The state has been providing some of those. They still have so much more to do. But I think one of the big messages, and you just spoke about this in your challenges, is that we need more capacity, right? PCC, of course, can sort of move, and this is what we're trying to do, is say, okay, what did we learn and what are we best positioned to support? We can't support all of these things as a small nonprofit, philanthropy dependent organization, but these are the things we think can move the needle the most, and we can dig into some of those. We can advocate for the state to do other things, and then we can work with institutions where they have some flexibility or agency in order to shift some of the campus level things that are affecting students. So I think, that is, if I can sort of open this conversation with some of those contextual factors and also some of the capacity constraints that institutions and PCC and the state, right? I think, sometimes we see that legislation and reasonable people can disagree on where the line of this is, but we see that legislation can help us move the needle in a lot of ways. We see funding from the state can help us move the needle in a lot of ways, but any of these things on their own are insufficient to the challenge at hand. So I want to thank you all for doing that and sort of open up that line of conversation as we go into answering some of these questions. So just wonder if any of you have any reflections on that, Rachel, Johanna, Paula.
Yeah, I'll start. I have a short reflection. I think one of the things that Rachel and I have thought a lot about is how Illinois in some ways is a favorable place to be doing this. And so kind of marking that and feeling like, I think, Lisa, to your point, celebrating the success of like, these equity plans exist. So there's something to build from, to critique and to reflect on. Like, that is important, to acknowledge that things nationally might be seeming fairly catastrophic, but at least at the state level, there is legislative support and kind of a more favorable environment for doing that work, and seeing how you can move within those kind of positive aspects that are happening.
Yeah, and I can begin to answer some of these questions coming through the Q&A and in the chat, and invite my colleagues here to speak to this as well. First question we got is about how have faculty been involved specifically, and is faculty involvement critical to change? I would say, I mean, again, the research on this is very clear. And I think it also makes, as we look at this empirically and see this, it makes a lot of sense because of how students have interaction and face time with faculty in a way that's different than any other position on the campus for the majority of students. I think also the scale within the institution. So we did do some things in the ILEA initiative in recognition of that and to try to provide support directly to faculty. I think some of those things, Dr. Estella Ben-Simone has been a leader at the Center for Urban Education out at the University of Southern California. We had her do a syllabus workshop once with faculty. We did this virtually, so more people could participate. It was kind of a deep dive analysis that faculty can use in sort of examining their teaching practice and pedagogy from a racial equity lens. So we did do some of that. I think that, this is very long-term commitment, hard work on behalf of the institutions that they need to do. We have seen some campuses within the ILEA initiative take this far further in terms of, building out diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, multicultural centers that do a lot of staff training and faculty training, and that it's, part of the practice, it's part of campus culture, it's integrated into the goals. We've seen other institutions, not just in Illinois, a lot of these are national best practices as well, but there are institutions within the ILEA cohort. And I know there are some now outside of the ILEA cohort that are starting to look at these things too, of looking at promotion and tenure practices and, how are they thinking about that? I've heard faculty members in interviews now say they were asked directly how they were going to support student retention and success. Those kinds of things did not happen before. And, I don't know what scale they're happening on. I would say probably not even close to what we need. But I do think that some of our experts and leaders who've spoken on these issues over time, such as Dr. Ben-Simone and Dr. Frank Harris, who we've had engaged in our work several times, talks about the ways in which you can engage the willing faculty in this work, and how can you make it easier for faculty to engage in this work. Faculty work, their work is hard, right? Their requirement for teaching and service and and research and publication is very steep. So how do you do this in a way that's accessible to faculty for the ones who want to do it, right? You have to start with the ones, and I think this is true of equity work overall, you have to start with the coalition of the willing. And that's what we did more broadly with ILEA in terms of bringing institutions together, but it's also true in terms of how the work really fans across the institutions at the individual level.
I mean, I would also say another way that faculty have been involved is digging into looking at DFW rates in their courses, and really taking a hard look at, who's succeeding, who's not succeeding, digging into the pedagogy to create more opportunities for students to succeed based on what they learned in terms of looking at the data. Another way that faculty have always been the big drivers in open educational resources, because they were the ones who saw that there were students in their classrooms 2, 3, 4 weeks into the start of a term that didn't have a textbook. And so most of our institutions, that we worked with, are working towards ensuring that. Faculty have been the big drivers in laptop loan programs as well. Students didn't have access to laptops and other resources.
I want to add about contingent faculty. And I think that's something else that on many campuses, right, that continues to be a challenge of, right, how are they part of the community? And then what are kind of the resources and space that those people have to be able to engage in any of these practices, right? So thinking about what does the faculty actually look like? And then what are the capacities for them to be able to engage in this in different ways? And then what are also the feedback mechanisms to be able to communicate that information, right? So if they are seeing things that Paula is mentioning, how are they able to engage, given how they're paid, right? Their engagement in the community can be variable. And so really thinking about what's happening with your contingent faculty who are engaging directly with your students.
Yeah, and this next question in the Q&A is about leadership. So if I am not interpreting this correctly, please feel free to correct me in the Q&A. But it asks what do we suggest for moving forward if ILEA work and commitments and suggestions are given to senior leadership, but it seems to not be a priority at the campus level of senior leadership, and it is left sort of at a standstill. I mean, one of the things that we have seen, and this is one of my deep interest areas, I did my dissertation research on this topic, is the role of campus leadership. I mean, we have seen it time and time again that this work was often, and this was true back when we started recruiting institutions in 2018, and it's still true today in a lot of different ways. The normative condition for institutions is that there are equity champions in different places across the campus far more frequently than there are equity champions leading the institutions. And I think that has changed over time. It has certainly changed in Illinois. You see more and more leaders speaking out on this, being centered on this, putting goals in place, aligning different parts of the institution. But it is still the exception to the rule. And I think in this current DEI climate, that is going to become even harder, right? Of where it was risky before, but in states like Illinois, it was much more common to have people speaking out on these things, to have the state focused on these, prioritizing these in strategic plans and other types of legislation. Have institutions participating in this. Another thing we saw that was very positive through these efforts was more and more institutions, submitted applications for the Aspen Prize, more and more joined Achieving the Dream Network and some other national collaboratives, or had their work elevated and recognized through awards and recognitions, through associations. Like, we are so excited to see the incredible work happening at the institutions in the state. And it often started with faculty and staff and other administrators that were not the president. But what we do see is that it's accelerated significantly when it is taken up by the president and the leadership team, because it becomes a context in which the priorities of the institution are clear and the resources and attention get aligned in those areas. So certainly the work started in these pockets of excellence and equity on the campuses. Sometimes it filtered up to the institutions, and the ones that made the most progress, it certainly was the case. But, you know, to just speak to my people in this moment, of those of us who care about this and are going to keep moving it forward, you know, we have been there before where this work was not getting the attention and resources it needs on our campuses or in the state or any other context, and we will be there again. But our missions of our institutions require us to pay attention to the students we serve in our institutions and to serve them well. That's actually our mission. And so I think keeping that as a North Star and doing what we can in this moment is really critical, even though it is not going to feel as good to us, and is going to be deeply frustrating and upsetting on so many levels.
I'm just going to add, there's also the notion of institutional survival. And so kind of to that last point Lisa made about serving the students being the key priority, making sure students are enrolled, retained, completing, all of that is going to help all of your institutions stay afloat. And doing that well requires knowing who is at your institution and making sure it's a place that they can do well in and thrive.
Yeah, and to the comment in the chat about, we got a comment in the chat about receiving feedback on equity plans. I think this means from the state that said to us we didn't have specific racial or ethnic groups targeted in our strategies to close gaps as a point of feedback. So that was certainly a point of feedback. I think the NORC study, NORC Fordham study, really took a look at that as well. Are we aligned in all of these different areas on this? I mean, I think in the comment asked for advice, I don't necessarily have advice on that. And as an equity practitioner and an advocate, you know, I do think it is imperative for us to think about our risk profile. I mean, that's just about what Johanna said, institutional survival, but the risk is not distributed evenly across all institutions of higher education, as we know. And if the state is going to continue to prioritize this, because we do exist in a state that it has a very different climate around these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, to continue to press forward where we can. But I think, you know, the work is what's important, and the way our students are experiencing our institutions, the outcomes that we're able to partner with them to provide for our students. I think those are the important things, even as some of the ways in which we name things may change. I think that is going to be something that we're all going to be required to pay a lot of attention to, and think very thoughtfully about in both directions as we move this forward. And I think, you know, the federal and public discourse is trying to get us to move in one direction of stopping doing these things. And I think we have to be very thoughtful about pressing in the other direction, because we know it's what our students need. It's what our missions require of us. And people of good conscience can say, this is what our institutions are designed for. This is the reason for our existence. But PCC will be talking more about these things. And I want to make sure we conclude on time. I want to thank you all for your deep engagement today, for joining us. A special thank you to our speakers for sharing their thoughts and lessons learned, and cataloging these things for us, to our funders that enabled all of this work over the years, and my deepest gratitude and respect to the ILEA institutions and all the folks on the partner campuses that did this work. They did incredible work over the past 6 or more years to advance equity and student success, and they are really the heroes in this story. As we've talked about a little bit here, I just want to name that this is an unprecedented time for our work in higher education. It's an unprecedented time for higher education in general, and for people who care about these things. We know that DEI has been and is being misrepresented, mischaracterized, maligned, deceptively used, confused, and to get people outraged. And it has been used selectively, dishonestly, and intentionally. I think all of that must be said. And we will continue to speak out about this. You know, PCC will speak out about it. We will convene institutions to talk about these things in different ways. But I do want to encourage everyone to really be thoughtful and take away from our conversation today how we must continue this march forward, because our students cannot wait. Our students are coming to our institutions at great expense and personal cost, and our mission demands that we serve them well so that they can take and reap the benefits that we know higher education can provide for them. You know, we all have heard the phrase knowledge is power, because we know that it is. Education is power and freedom, and that is exactly why it's under attack right now. We know how important our colleges and universities are to the backbone of our state economy, to our individual financial well-being in a changing economy, with social mobility at the forefront. And I also do want to say higher ed as a necessary pillar in democracy and the upholding of democracy. There are so many things that come from our institutions and our communities, and nobody knows that better than the people standing on the campuses every single day. So are we going to sit down and be quiet and hide, and let them diminish our students and our colleges and universities, take away our Pell Grants, take away our funding for our institutions to be excellent? I would say the answer to that is no. And we're going to have to do that in different ways and be very thoughtful about that. But I think it's important that we do think about that. So thank you all for being our partners. Thank you for being here today. We look forward to continuing this work with you in the months and years to come. Thank you.